cite all the time, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job. But this is a passage which I've had quoted to me quite a bit. We're in Esther 4. Do you remember where we ended up? In a happy place or a sad place at the end of chapter 3? Remember we said we were down at the bottom of the well, looking up? Scary, sad place, right? And what we had learned is that King Ahasuerus has agreed with Haman that all of the Jews would be killed. And that's a horrible thing, of course. And so I think it's on. Let me move it closer to my Bible here. There we go. Maybe that helps. I don't know. So, but they were in a bad place. Remember in Esther chapter 3, go back and look at that. What you see there is that in chapter 3, verse 8, Haman tells the king, hey, there's this people scattered and dispersed throughout your kingdom. And he says in verse 9, if it's pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. That's what he wanted, all the Jews destroyed. Remember, he bribed them. He said, I'll give you 10,000 talents. And he lied about them, that they were not doing the king's laws. Sorry, something's going on there. I don't know what it is. And then, I think maybe he's adjusting it back there. You go check and see. John was fiddling with it. Sorry for the interruption. Would you check and see what's going on? And so the king's scribes in verse 12 are summoned, and they sent out the edict throughout all of the nations. They hurried out, and at the end of it, all the Jews are under a death sentence. Can you imagine, Alan, if everybody said, hey, we're going to kill everybody in your family, you feel good about that? No, you wouldn't feel it. And, if we said, hey, everybody in Ghana, wipe them out. I mean, that hits home. If they were to say, everybody in Springfield that lives here, you're going to die. I don't know about you, but I'd be running for get out, get my bag and run. You wouldn't want to be here when that happens. That's what's happened to the Jews. They're in a bad situation. And that's where we end up. And the question was, is God still present? Is God still, it's not coming on?
It's low. It's like low upstream.
I don't know what's going on. Is there another one of these? Is there another one of these maybe we could try? Sorry guys, we're having a little bit of technical, what do they call it? Difficulties. Is God still present in moments like this when things go really wrong? Of course he is. Of course he is. And he's behind the scenes present. And you remember one way that we know that. I have a little thing here. We'll see if that works any better. John's checking the audio there. He's already down on the spot. So I don't know, John. Is it any better? You got your feed on that? No? Hello, 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 hello? No? No, I think it's just one. It makes me think the feed is turned down. Can you check that? Sorry, guys. Anyway, we'll do what we can on that. I will speak very loud. Okay, so where we were saying God is present in this, and he's going to be helpful to him even in this difficult circumstance. Okay, so as we come into chapter 4, you got to ask, what would be the natural reaction to this kind of news that we have disaster coming upon us? Okay. Now, we've learned a little bit about Mordecai and Esther already. Question: were Mordecai and Esther the kind of people who shared with everybody that they were Jews? They were people who, no, Bethany, they didn't. They kept it to themselves, right? They didn't tell. Remember, Mordecai told Esther, don't tell anybody that you're a Jew. And Mordecai had shared with some people that he was, but he had told Esther, don't say anything. And so you might think their approach was just to say, hey, things are bad. I'm going to put my head down and duck and not let it be known who I am. And that might be a natural reaction. But is that what Mordecai does? No, what we find out is that Mordecai, when he hears what's about to happen to the people, he suddenly becomes very public with who he is. We're going to see, he lets it be known that he is very sad about what's about to happen to the Jews. So that's my question. If things are bad, am I going to be someone who ducks and hides, or am I going to go out there and try to do something? I wonder how you feel about that. What would you do? Let's read in Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, how Mordecai responds, and see what we think we would do in this case. Read with me, Esther chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out in the midst of the city and cried out with a loud and bitter cry. I wonder what that would sound like. Micah, if you were to give a loud and bitter cry, what would you do? What would it sound like? No. You don't know? A loud and bitter cry. Have you ever cried? This is an interesting question to ask a young man. Huh? Yeah, a few several times, yeah. So if you were to make a loud and bitter cry, what would it sound like? Good. For those who are listening on the live stream, it was something like this. A little bit higher if you had it. And I don't want to make light of it. The idea is that if you have ever been in a moment where you out loud cried bitterly, I can think of a few times I've done that. That is, you're in the depths of despair. We don't do that very often. Barbara, can you think of a time where you cried out loud bitterly? I mean, we don't like to think about those moments. We try to block those moments, right? Yeah. Anybody? No such like, we have to figure that out. Okay. So you got your loud and bitter cry indicates that things are good. And that's what he does. It said in verse 2, it says, he went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and decree reached, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and much of them lay down in sackcloth and ashes. Question. When things are very difficult in the world for God's people, what do God's people do here? What do they do? What's kind of their basic approach, Kobe? What do they do in this situation? Pray. You go and pray? What do you say? Pray. And they're lamenting, aren't they? They're crying out loud. They're acknowledging what is wrong. And do we have examples of lament in the Bible, in the Psalms, in the book of... Is there a book of the Bible named for lament? Well, thank you. I was trying to remember. Lamentations. If you want to go, we're not looking at it tonight. If you want to go to like the Lamentations 3, what you see is examples of God's people in exile crying out to God, why? Why is this happening to me? And so that's a very important point, a recognition to God of what has happened. God's people in faith cry out to God. They cry out to each other. And we need to acknowledge that. So if there's a situation in your life, your family, your work, your health, is it appropriate to cry to God? Absolutely. I would kind of worry if you didn't. Why would it be worrisome if you didn't cry to God? What might that indicate? If you don't cry out to God in a bad situation, what might that tell you? What's that? You lack faith that God can hear or that he can do anything about it. Right? Like my car had a transmission problem recently. And so, my daughter was there up in her room working on her homework. I didn't tell my daughter about my transmission problem. Why wouldn't I tell my daughter about my transmission problem? She didn't know the first thing about transmissions, right? I have faith in my daughter, but not that she can handle a transmission. I didn't go out and cry to her because I knew she couldn't do anything about it. And if we don't cry to God about our situations, like you said, that's a sign that we don't think we can do anything about it. So this is an act of faith on Mordecai. And he goes out publicly. He didn't go up into the palace because he's not allowed to, but he puts on sackcloth and ashes. You all know that's the sign of what? The mourning. Things are rough when you An example of this in our life is when we see situations in our culture where things have gotten so bad, moral. Do we just accept it and not say anything about it, or do we at least acknowledge and cry out that it's gotten bad? You think about the situation with in our country when it comes to for example whether or not couples who are together, are they observing God's law when it comes to their relationship with one another? So, in our society, oftentimes men and women feel like they don't need to be married in order to enter into a sexual relationship. Right? Is that what God says? No, He says sex is reserved for the marriage relationship, and that's people make mistakes all the time, but we should recognize that that is something that God intended just for husband and wife. And so we need to lament and cry out and say, let's not do that. Let's recognize that that's a relationship that we should hold till marriage. And if a couple finds themselves engaged in that already, what should they do if they're not married? Well, they should stop it and save themselves for the marriage relationship. That we should lament those kind of things and hold those things up in life. And that's not to judge anybody or condemn anybody. It's just to say we know what God wants and we cry for His will to be done. That's an example. So we should be able to name those things. But the Jews are in a different situation. They're under pain of death. So look what happens. Now Mordecai in the rest of the chapter, he comes to the realization, hey, what help can we get? What possibly could help us in this situation? And he goes, aha, I know. What could affect change? Well, Esther. Why could Esther help out the situation? She has access to the king, right? She has access to the king. And so Mordecai, we're going to see, is going to start to address Esther about what she should do. And I just observed that itself is an act of faith. Mordecai realizes, hey, I can do something that can affect this horrible situation. And that's an act of faith. And so you got to ask yourself, in the situation you're in, what can you do to try to improve it? Notice what happens. Mordecai's going to approach Esther and let her know what's happened. Notice in verse 4. Let's read down through verse 11. When Esther's young women, remember, she's now the queen. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. So she didn't know about this. Now she knows. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Did she know about the command against the Jews yet? Evidently not. She's living in her palace. This news had not come to her. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Okay, so this is a big ask. Let's stop there. What's the ask that Mordecai is making of Esther? Esther, now that you know what is happening, go and do what? Talk to the king. Get him to overturn this order. That's a big ask, right? And if you're Esther, what might you say? Well, let's see, because her response is telling. So notice here in verse 10, then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all of the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I likely to happen to me? I'll get killed. Okay. So is this an heroic response on the part of Esther? No, no. Now I just want to point out, the book of Esther shows Esther and Mordecai not to be perfect, completely courageous people. We've seen that already, right? Mordecai, don't live by your view, right? And Esther seems to go along with the king's plans for the to be his concubine. And now Esther similarly is saying, hey, I don't want to do this because it'll be my death. You might think she would say, there are millions of Jews who are going to die if I'm unwilling to go to the king, right? I'm going to sacrifice my life for them. Did she say that? No, she's a bit selfish. Understandably, none of us want to die, right? And so she's cautious in this moment. And so this is a very human response. And so the point would be, this woman is trying to preserve her life. She's trying to care for herself, and her response is basically, I don't want to do this. Okay, so what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Let's finish up the chapter here. These are the key verses here. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Okay, let's just pause there and kind of think this in. These are key verses in the book of Esther. So three things. First of all, when Mordecai responds to Esther, he says, hey, I know you want to save your life, but don't you understand that if this happens, you're going to die anyway? You're a Jew. And the command is that all the Jews are going to be killed in the kingdom. And so it's kind of a gut check to say, you're not going to be rescued from this either way. And think about that. Is that an easy thing for Mordecai to say? No, he doesn't want this to happen. But what is he? Is he honest or dishonest with her? He's honest with her. He's frank with her. Okay? Question. Who is more likely to be honest with you, a friend or an enemy? Friend. Yeah. For the ancient times, people observed the person who is most frank with you, in a loving way, but most frank with you, is likely your friend. Right? So, Linda got this haircut. And everybody's saying, Linda, that's a beautiful haircut. Beautiful haircut. But we all know it's not. Right? That it really, it's not. And if we were to be real friends to her, we say, Linda, you got to go back. You got it. Whatever they did, undo it or do more of it. And a friend, and of course, we were serious with you, Linda, because we were friends and we were telling you. But my point is you've had people, you say, Christian who grew out of sideburns, right? He grew out of sideburns. And he has an enemy at work. And he's like, that's the biggest thing I've ever seen. But I don't like for Christians. Someone go, Christian, this looks great. Right? He's your enemy. Is he telling you the truth? No, he wants you to embarrass yourself. Right? The friend is to be the one that says, Christian, and just a word of the wise, ex-nay on the sideburns. Right? Yes. Are you taking that personally? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I was kidding. I didn't even notice. Do you have sideburns today? Okay. Y'all see my point. You got to watch it. So, we've experienced this. When someone comes up and flatters you, aren't you a little bit suspicious? A little suspicious, right? Have you all seen what's going on in the nation's capital recently when the president of Ukraine comes in to Donald Trump about things. Ukraine wants U.S. support for the war over there, right? And so he came in, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, came in yesterday, and he comes in, and, Donald Trump told him, he said, you need to wear a suit next time you come to see me. Guess what he had on this time? A suit. Had a suit on, and he comes in, and he just starts thanking him over and over again, flattering him for everything that the U.S. has done, right? And then 3 days before, Trump had been in a conference with Vladimir Putin up in Alaska. Y'all see that? They had that up there. And when Trump gets with him, Putin says, hey, you know what? If you had been president, this war would have never happened. You saw that? Right? I don't more believe that Putin believes that than the man in the moon. But what is he doing? He's buttering it up. And Trump's like, you hear that? He's speaking the truth. He knows what Trump wants to hear. Whatever you think of Trump, you know when he's getting flattered, right? And so, the students, I had a student the other day who came up to me, and he's a student who's always a troublemaker. And he says, they call me Dr. Eber. He says, Dr. Eber, you're the GOAT. I said, what'd you call me? The GOAT? You know what that means? What does that mean? You're what? You're really good. You know what GOAT stands for? Greatest of all time. So if you go up, I say, Lynn, you're the GOAT. I'm really laying it on thick. And I know this kid. He's always in trouble, and he's buttering me up. Right? And so do you think I take that compliment very seriously? No, in fact, I'm a little bit insulted by it because he thinks it's going to have an effect on me. You see, okay, but here's my point. Zero in on Mordecai. Mordecai is telling Esther the truth. Esther, you're going to die either way. Right? And that's the truth. And a real friend tells the truth. Right? This is, I'll just say, my wife recently, won't say what it was, but about a week and a half ago, she comes in and she tells me a hard truth. A hard truth. Okay? And I got pretty upset about it. Okay? But I didn't, I hate myself. But I was upset about it. And the next day she asked me how I was. I said, I don't want to talk about it. I said, you need to give me some time. and so I fumed for about 3 days. And I knew that I was punishing her by fuming. That bothered me. Right? But yesterday evening, I came in. I said, you were right. I didn't like how you said it. She says, yeah, I'm sorry. I could have said it better. I said, well, thank you for that. But I said, you were right. And no one else would have said that. And I really appreciate it. She's like, well, thank you. And I just have to say, no one else would have told me that. It was nothing big. It was something I needed to hear. And I love her because she's probably the one person in the world that would have had the guts to say that to me. And that's what your wife's there for, right? You ever had that? I'm sure you have. You ever fume over it? I'm sure you have. But, it took me 3 days. I don't know, maybe there's something symbolic about that. I don't know. But I had to rise from the grave from her statement. And, I respect her because she was born. She was my Mordecai. I'm going down this road to say, you need to be that person, though. Lovingly, truthfully. Talk about that last week. Yeah, RC.
Friends tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear.
Amen. Enemies flatter you. Friends are frank with you. Right? The frankness of friends is proverbial. And now friends can be, don't get me wrong, friends can be mean and cruel and not be good friends. And we don't want to be that, but we want to be good friends. And so, and I'll tell you, people who we get so stuck on our self-importance that we think, oh, I'm the only one that can do this. Aren't I important? And so we become prideful. We realize, no, God can use God can use a donkey to accomplish his purposes, right? And so we can accomplish God's will, but not be think too highly of it. I told you the other day about the idea that, one woman said that what she wants to do in her life is to be the donkey on which Jesus rides into the lives of others. Notice, we can thank God, the idea that Jesus rode a donkey into Jerusalem on the triumphal entry. We can think God is using us. And I believe he is. I believe he's using all of you. But does that mean that we're some big, important thing? Of course not. We're just like the donkey that Jesus rode onto in the lives of others. We don't do these things. So one lesson is, let's not be so prideful that we think we're the only way that God can accomplish purpose. I tell that, and I would say that about the church here. Look, if this church was, I don't want it to, but if this church was to disband tomorrow, could God still accomplish his will in this place? Absolutely. Wouldn't want to see that, but that's the thing. And so we just need to trust that God's in control. Good. Okay, the most powerful statement is the next one he makes, I think, when he then calls, he tries to encourage Esther in a situation. And this is the most quoted. If you mark your Bible, this is the one to mark. This is the most quoted verse in Esther, I think, bar none. And he says, who knows, this is the middle of verse 14, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? In other words, this position that you find yourself in the king's harem, in his court, who knows that God didn't put you in that position, in that place, for this very moment where you can make a difference at this time for God's people. And so, oftentimes I'll hear people, they'll quote this. They'll say, let's say, Kevin gets a job, and he's in an HVAC company working away, and there's a boss that is a kind of a scoundrel of a guy, but he really likes Kevin, and maybe Kevin can encourage him to be a better man. And I say, hey, man, you know what? This guy really likes you. Who knows? But God has put you in this position for such a time as this. Who knows? And the idea is we should look at our lives, as such. God puts us in these positions, and we should be good stewards, good caretakers of what God has given us. Right? Your family has come to live with you in your house. Who knows but what God has put you in this position for such a time as this? You're able to affect a lot of people by your skills in your job. Who knows what God is doing?
God asks you to do something
Yes.
to the detriment of you, but for the betterment of others, you got to look to the betterment of others first before thinking.
That's right. So John just pointed out that, in that position, you may need to be sacrificial and serve others and put their needs before your own. And I think that's exactly what Mordecai is saying. You need to step out there and take this risk, because that seems to be where God is putting you. And I think that's the key point, because you know better than anyone what your position could allow you to do to help others. Right? And so, the question is, are you going to step into that, or are you going to step back from that? Right? The greatest example of this, in human history is Jesus. Right? His purpose was planned from creation. God put him there for the purpose of justifying us, of giving us a relationship to God. And so God put him there for a purpose, right? And Jesus accepted that purpose and did what God called him to do, and that's what we're to do ourselves. And this could be little things. You think, well, I don't have much of a position. I don't have much of a situation that would impact a lot of people. But the point is that wherever you are, God has put you there. My question is, why? Why? What can you do? And that's a major point of the profession, is to believe in God's providence and to have the reflection, okay, why am I here? Here's a few litmus tests. First of all, what gave Esther her position to where she could affect and gain effective faith and duty? Think about the story of this story. What gave Esther her position? Why is she there in the king's court? Yeah. Her beauty. Right? So, some of us are out of luck on that. But we got to ask, I may not have beauty, but God has given me something. Right? What's the gift God has given me? So, some of us, we say, don't have any, but you do have a gift. R.C. has the gift of a sweet disposition. And he's funny. And he could disarm anybody. We need to send you over to Vladimir Putin and talk about this Ukraine war. I think you could convince him. I'm serious. That's a gift. God has put you in this place to encourage us. You've strengthened me. You've strengthened everyone around here. You find RC a strength? Absolutely. Absolutely. Gary comes here from the northern climes of Michigan. A man with skills, serious but loving. And he has loved this place. You've given us gifts of your skill and your attitude. He has blessed us immensely. And most importantly, you've given us an A. So, that's good. But you just see, you're using it. So the question is, and I can go around the room. What are we using our gifts for? And I would just say, I don't get to, well, I'll not call anybody else. I don't want to embarrass people. But I could go around the room and do that call. And say, God has put you, I see the gifts you have, so use them. And so I would just ask you, who knows? Christian, Lynn, Patrick, who knows? Whether you have come to this place for such a time as this. Right? I'll tell you, if people say that to you, you'll have two thoughts, right? No, not me. No, not me. But the second thought is, oh boy, that's a lot of responsibility. You start to feel. Other thoughts on that? I feel Esther right about now. Don't you? I feel her. She's like, oh, Mordecai. Just what to say. Well, notice. So what happens? So Esther has been getting though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered. She had changed, hadn't she? She had gone from, I don't want to do this because I'm going to die, to being encouraged, being warned, being really admonished by Mordecai, and she changes. And what I find interesting is, it's just like it took me 3 days to get over it. It took her 3 days to kind of, Bill, I don't know what it is. I mean, I actually kind of wonder about that. She didn't act in anger. She was receptive to it. She says, okay, Sunday,